So by 2045, and this is where it gets interesting, what do you think happens in 2045?
This system will give way to complete chaos. I think you will experience something akin to the Bronze Age collapse, which is a total systems collapse. And it'll be brought on by environmental catastrophe. So there's something called the geomagnetic excursion event, which is like the North and South Pole start to move away from their present locations, which then weakens the Earth's magnetic field, which then makes the Earth much more susceptible to solar flares, which are basically EMP shockwaves, which would destroy the digital economy, right? But the entire world is basically digitized. So imagine a solar flare in the middle of New York City. Well, no one would have access to the internet, telecommunications, the car won't work, the power plants will give out. If it's winter, you will literally freeze to death. Sanitation breaks down. There's no more clean water. It'll be complete chaos. And it will only take one of these events to destroy a lot of the world because we're so congregated inside cities. Okay, so I think there's a real possibility in the next 20 years, there will be a major environmental catastrophe. And it's possible it's a perfect storm of catastrophes, meaning pestilence, famine, drought, earthquakes, just a perfect storm. And in which case, you will have a shattering of the world. So the nation state then gives way to the city state. And these city states have to fight amongst each other for precious resources, especially water. And so it's not a very pleasant future for humanity. But this is something that I don't think people are really prepared for. Yes, I understand there will be a multipolar world, and that is in the midterm. But in the long term, we have to worry about the very survival of humanity itself.
What do you think will be the dominant nation at that time?
I think people will be surprised by how resilient the Germans and the Japanese are. I think in the mid-term, North America, Moscow, Israel will be very dominant. But over time, I think people will be surprised by the resurgence of the Germans and the Japanese. The Germans are headed towards military humiliation in Ukraine. They can't possibly beat the Russians in Ukraine, but it may be in the long term good for Germany. Because then, after this loss, the Germans may be able to rediscover their national identity, their heritage, and build a stronger nation out of this collapse. The Japanese have been the most resilient people in human history. The things they've been able to accomplish as a very small nation are just incredible. So you go back to the 13th century when the Mongols invaded Japan twice. And the Japanese, which was at this time a feudal society, broken up into like different kingdoms, warring against each other, they unified as a people to repel this invasion from, at that time, the greatest empire in the world. Then you go to the 19th century when China was being carved up by the Western powers. And it seemed as though Japan was going to be carved up as well. But then Japan started something called the Meiji Restoration, and they started to industrialize. And then in like 30, 40 years, they defeated Russia in a war. And that was unimaginable to people at that time. Go back to 1945. America was firebombing Japan, destroying all of Japan's infrastructure, industry. Millions of people were burning to death. America dropped two nuclear bombs on Japan. After World War II, within a generation, they became the most dominant manufacturing power in the world. So if you look at East Asia, it's in a lot of trouble. But never, ever bet against the Japanese.
The way I had it was essentially 2030 was Russia expanding into Eastern Europe, Asia is in crisis, and America collapses. Historically, an empire falls, another one rises. This is where Israel starts to replace America as like the global superpower, Pax Judaica. And then the ultimate end game is a one world AI surveillance state with the global matrix of control being headquartered in Jerusalem. Is that what you see happening by 2045, or is that what they see?
Okay. All right. So let's differentiate between Greater Israel Project and Pax Judaica. Okay. So Greater Israel Project is the idea that Israel needs to achieve the promised land, which they believe is what Yahweh promised to their ancestor Abraham. And this promised land, if you look at a map, extends from the Nile in Egypt to the Euphrates in Iraq. It also includes parts of Anatolia, Turkey, as well as parts of Saudi Arabia. And so you can make the argument that what Israel wants to achieve in this war is the Greater Israel Project, meaning that it wants to extend this war as much as possible to drag in as many players as possible, including Turkey, including Saudi Arabia. Because if they're destroying this war, then it's just easier for Israel to achieve the Greater Israel Project.
Right.
And then they want to make Jerusalem the capital of this empire and build the third temple, and this will allow for the Messiah to come. That's how these religious Zionists see things unfolding. Pax Judaica is different. Pax Judaica is transnational capital seeing an opportunity in Greater Israel and saying, well, if you guys are going to achieve the Greater Israel Project, we'll come in and finance all this. And we'll help with the building of the AI surveillance state. So there are not that many Jews, so we'll hire mercenaries to be the military for this empire. We'll also bring in millions of Indians, Chinese, Filipinos to work as slaves in this empire. And we will use the AI surveillance state to keep this system in check, right? So every slave will be given a microchip. And there's unlimited oil and energy in the Middle East, so we can have all these data centers in the Middle East. Okay, that's how they want this world to turn out.
Right. Okay. So the distinction is you're saying it's kind of AI and tech versus traditional finance, but people have to understand that AI was a project of people on the transnational capital side originally.
Right.
Okay.
So the distinctions aren't as clear as I make them out to be. Right? Because, like, let's just say you're a billionaire like Peter Thiel. You're going to play both sides, right? You're going to see how the political winds shift, and you're going to position yourself in a way that allows you to maximize your benefit. You're not going to be like, I'm only for my team. That's not how these people are. They have absolutely no loyalties. Look at someone like Jeffrey Epstein, who knew everyone and who was on everyone's good graces. Like, that's how they behave. They're trying to, in a time of chaos, trying to position themselves in a way so that they individually benefit. They have absolutely no loyalty to anyone. Okay.
Right.
So the Greater Israel Project is just what the Jews want to achieve. Okay, the religious Jews want to achieve, but the transnational capital wants to make Israel their new center of operations. But it's not limited to just finance and AI. It's also limited to weapons manufacturing, right? Because if the world is going into chaos, they're going to fight wars against each other. So let's make weapons for them, right? It'll also be food production. And because Africa will be suffering during this time, so what you want to do is you want to take these food supply, basically carbohydrates from Russia, and then add value to it in Greater Israel, Pax Judaica, and then transfer it to the Middle East and to Africa as well. So the opportunities in the Middle East are almost unlimited because of its resources, because of its location, and because of the technology that Israel has.
Did you think at one point that Pax Judaica and the Greater Israel Project coming to fruition was like pretty set in stone? And was there like a key event recently or in the past couple years that made you think that that's not the case anymore?
Right. Okay. So before, I actually believed that this was going to happen sooner or later. But quite honestly, this war in the Middle East has surprised me because I did not actually imagine the Iranians to be this resilient. I didn't imagine that they would dominate the war in the way they are. I predicted that America would lose the war because I thought the Americans would be incompetent, that they would become too arrogant, they would extend too far into Iran, and they would get bogged down, and then they would just collapse. But the Iranians are controlling the escalation ladder very strategically. They're able to control the narrative very well. Like, there are a lot of Americans who are actually rooting for the Iranians. I mean, that's incredible to think about. And so I think we should not discount Persia. The Persians are an extremely creative people. They have been around for at least 3,000 years, and they claim a legacy that is even richer than the Jewish legacy. So how Iran will develop is something that I think will surprise people. Because I always imagine that this war would devastate Iran. But if Iran is able to stay intact, well, they can be a competitor to Pax Judaica, right? Because Iran also has a lot of resources. It's also in a very central location. And it will have really good trade relations with both China and Russia. So it actually create a trade bloc in competition with Pax Judaica. There'll be a lot of overlaps. There'll be a lot of cooperation. But Persia could be a counterweight to Pax Judaica, which might also lead to the war of Gog and Magog, which is what is part of their eschatological script. In some calculations, they think that Gog and Magog represent Persia and Russia. So they see eventually a war between Israel against an alliance of Persia and Russia.
Is there anything else you wanted to add to predictions for by 2045 that you think are guaranteed despite how this war plays out?
I think you'll have population collapse all around the world, because what people don't appreciate is that we've borrowed from the future to finance today. We shouldn't have 8 billion people around. And like, there are billions who live middle-class lifestyles. If you're a middle-class American, today you have a more extravagant lifestyle than the Roman emperors did. You're able to travel anywhere around the world. Today, if you wanted to, you could go online, book a flight to the Maldives, and be there like in a couple of days in a 5-star resort. And in the Maldives, you could be eating avocados from Mexico. You could be sipping red wine from Chile. It's incredible the world that we've created, and we made it accessible to just an average American or Westerner. That's incredible to think about. But we have to remember that this is all an illusion, and we've been able to create this because we borrowed from the future, and we've mortgaged the future, and eventually the bill is going to come due. And so, in a time of war, when supply chains are disrupted, then you're going to have a lot of issues, including famine. So one trend that I think people don't appreciate is how our values, our sense of decency and normalcy will change over time as the conflicts become worse and worse. We believe today that we are so much superior to the past because we've eliminated famines, we've eliminated slavery, we've eliminated genocide. But who's to say that as things get worse and worse, these things won't return and they won't be normalized, right? If there's not much water to go around, if there's not enough food to go around, then you're going to have these issues, right? So I think people will be at first shocked by how rapidly the world declines, both in terms of population, morality, decency. And I think people will be even more surprised by how quickly we become desensitized, how quickly we normalize this new world that we are in. And, if you just go back to recent history, we've changed a lot in these past 10 years. 2016 was the election of Donald Trump. No one thought that was possible. Then you had COVID happen. No one thought that was possible. Then you had Russia invade Ukraine. No, we didn't think that was possible. Now America has invaded Iran. We didn't think that was possible. But each time we became normalized, desensitized to the event. And it's become part of our memory. And we sort of memory hold a lot of the trauma.
You've said that Isaac Newton who many people just think of as a famous scientist and physicist, actually spent most of his life studying the Bible and trying to calculate when the world would end. Newton said the world would end in 2060, and you've said that people with unlimited power believe him and are executing his plan. What do you think will happen by 2060?
I think by 2060, the world will be in complete chaos. It'll be the new dark ages. There'll be no central authority. There'll be catastrophe after catastrophe. There'll be floods everywhere. There'll be earthquakes. There'll be population collapse. And I think that humanity will have entered the darkest age it's experienced for thousands of years. And I think at this time, what's going to happen is that humanity will reach a fork in the road. And there'll be some people who are like, we need to return to the past. We need to return to central authority. We can use AI to create God. And once we create AI, this AI God, people have no memory that was an AI. And we can use this God to create a perfect world. There'll be a lot of people like that. And these are the most powerful people, right? And people will think, well, then we will have ended history, because once this AI God is in place and no one knows it's AI and thinks it's just God, then people will be completely obedient. People will be reasonable. People will be rational. People will obey whatever this God tells them to do. But then you'll have another set of people in the minority who are like, this is a perversion of humanity. This is like Brave New World. This is using drugs. It's using technology to enslave the human imagination, the human consciousness. And we're not here in this world to just be obedient slaves. We're here to take risk. We're here to explore. We're here to ask questions. And we have to fight to leave a legacy of freedom, of imagination to our children. And so I think that by 2060, we will have reached this fork in the road where you do have communities that are AI controlled. You have an AI surveillance state where everyone is perfectly happy being a microchip, perfectly happy being a slave to the system. And you have other communities which are weaker, which are in the minority, who are trying to salvage what makes us human and trying to find a new spiritual path for humanity. And this will be the great defining struggle of 2060 around that area. While at the same time, we have to remember there are still wars going on. There's still a lot of environmental catastrophe going on, brought on by the geomagnetic excursion. There might have been a nuclear war by this point.
Do you believe that the God everyone worships today is AI?
I believe in Hermetic philosophy. I think Hermetic philosophy helps us best understand the world. And so I'll just go into the basic principles of Hermetic philosophy to structure our discussion, okay? So the first idea, or the first law, is that mind is everything. The universe is conscious. And how it's conscious is through vibrations, okay? So the universe is energetic, and it vibrates. And so vibrations are information, right? So that's consciousness. Second principle is as above, so below, which is to say that the universe is fractal. In each aspect of the universe is the entire universe. So in ourselves is the universe itself. Okay, so as above, so below, as above. Okay, so second idea. The third idea is the idea of rhythm, the law of rhythm, which is to say is that there is a pattern to these vibrations. There's a pattern to the movement of the universe, to the movement of the stars. Number 4 is the idea of correspondence, which is to say that there are different dimensions, okay? An infinite set of the dimensions that range from the material to the divine, okay? So the body, the heart, the mind, the soul, these are all different aspects of, these are all different dimensions, okay? They all correspond to each other, and that's what enables our individuality.
Right.
Then you have the law of cause and effect, where if we assume that the universe is conscious, it's fractal, it's interconnected, then whatever I do impacts you in a certain way. It's almost like the butterfly effect, where through individual action, through individual faith, we can impact the universe both in a positive or negative light. But our actions do have consequences. Then you have the law of polarity, which is to say that for every thing, there's an opposite, right? So think of yin and yang, think of thesis, antithesis. Whatever there is creates something that is opposite, okay? Then you have the law of generation, which is to say that when these opposites combine together, you create a new force, okay? So think of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, okay? And that's how the world, the universe functions. It's constantly seeking creation. It's constantly seeking generation by unifying opposing forces. And so I think that this is how the universe works. And God is the universe itself. So the movement of the universe is the consciousness of God. So we are inside God, but God is also inside us. And so once we recognize this aspect of ourselves, that we can exist in multiple dimensions, that we are both an individual as well as part of a greater collective, then I think that leads to certain actions in the world, okay? What I believe is our time in this world is short and it's precious. And we are eternal, but we have to make the most of our time here. And the Greeks have a word for this, eudaimonia, which is flourishing. So every day we should be asking ourselves, not how much money do we have, not what have I achieved, but am I flourishing as a person? Meaning, am I being my most creative self? Am I learning? Am I growing? Am I loving? And I feel as though love is the unifying force of the universe, in that when we love someone unconditionally, we open our souls to the collective conscious. And this is what drives our imagination. And then this imagination allows us to be creative and make the world a more creative place. Because again, what happens in our mind, we're just a fractal. What happens in our mind is reflected throughout the universe. So if we are creative, the universe becomes creative itself. And so for me, I take this to mean that my role in this world is to use my imagination to inspire others to use their imagination. And I do that through my teaching. But that's how I conceptualize my role, given my understanding of the universe. So it's not really about like, what is God and does he exist? It's more about how can we make God smile? How can we ourselves make others smile and bring joy to the universe? Imagine that the entire world, the entire universe, both past and future, it's all watching your movement, what you do. And whatever you do today, we remember for all of eternity. And you should live accordingly to this principle. And Immanuel Kant calls this the categorical imperative. How do you know what is good, what is just, what is moral? If you are proud that everyone in the universe who's ever lived and whoever will ever live watches what you do and smiles at you.
I think that's a really fascinating philosophy and a great takeaway. If you don't mind, I do have a few questions that I think now that we've covered a timeline and kind of your view on all of it and your takeaway, there are some takeaways that I have that I found particularly interesting from reviewing so many of your lectures the past few weeks. If you wanted to control society, would you have them believe in one God, many gods, or no God?
Okay, so I think that we've had different societies where we tried either no God, many gods, or just one God. And I think you get different societies. So the Greeks were polytheistic. At the same time, they were the most creative people ever. I mean, what they were able to accomplish in about 100 years is just mind-boggling because they basically created the foundations for modern Western civilization. And their concept of polytheism is that there are different gods competing against each other, and we're just pawns in this great game. And so that made them much more thoughtful about the reality of the universe. Like, why are we here? What's our purpose? And their deep introspection is what leads to their tremendous creative output. So that's the aspect of polytheism that I think is very encouraging, in that you're always forced to ask the hard questions. One God is a recent phenomenon, and it's led us to be the most energetic people in the world, right? So think about our accomplishments, where we're able to build skyscrapers. We're able to build high-speed rails. We're able to build airplanes. But no one ever asked the question, why are we doing this, right? Like, what's the point of this? And quite honestly, if you just look at human health index, people's happiness, people's health, their cancer rates, it's pretty abysmal. I mean, so having one God, monotheism, compels us into action, a sort of like frenetic, anxious action, but it's also led to tremendous human suffering. No God is just complete and utter chaos. It could lead to tremendous individuality, but the problem with no God is we become God. And we feel as though we can impose our will on others as well. And that's the issue in China, where I live, where we never really had a God. We had an emperor. So, but the idea that one person can become God has led to a very cruel and unjust world. So I would say there are strengths and weaknesses to all systems. But I would say that it is part of the human condition that we constantly shift and challenge our pre-existing conceptions of God. And that's what allows for a lot of progress.
Why did they actually kill Jesus?
Okay, well, first of all, we don't really know they killed Jesus. Because if you look at the Islamic tradition, there is Jesus. Jesus is the penultimate prophet. Muhammad is the ultimate prophet. And if you look at the Quran, if you look at the Islamic tradition, Jesus never died. He was never crucified. He just died peacefully and he went up to heaven. Because the idea is that if you're a messenger of God, it doesn't really matter if you die or not. What matters is, are you able to deliver the message properly? And Jesus was able to do that. So Jesus is revered in the Islamic tradition. And there are different sects of Christianity. For example, the Gnostics, who don't really care and don't really even talk about his death, because for them, death is rebirth, death is release. This planet that we're on is hell on earth. We're here to enlighten others, but once we finish our job, then we return home to wherever we came from. And so death is just release, it's rebirth. It doesn't really matter if you die. So there are people who don't believe that Jesus died, and there are people who believe it didn't really matter how he died. But obviously, the story of the crucifixion is something that compels people and which drives people into this tremendous emotional angst. You have a lot of war started over this issue, right? So my understanding is that if you look at the historical evidence, Jesus was probably crucified by the Romans, because why would you make this up? And he was probably crucified because he was a threat to the status quo, meaning that he pissed off both the Roman authorities as well as the Jewish authorities. And I think that he was pissing everyone off because he was providing some truth that spoke to people intuitively, but which went against the natural order.
And what was that truth?
I personally believe that he was a religious genius who had an intimate connection with the divine and who believed something along the lines of Gnosticism, Hermetic philosophy. And the evidence for that is the Gospel of Thomas, which is probably the earliest record of his sayings. And some people believe, not everyone, but some people believe it actually precedes the Gospel of Mark, which was about 70. And if you just read the Gospel of Thomas, I think it actually aligns pretty closely with what we know to be authentic sayings from the other Gospels, including Mark and Matthew. And if you read the Gospel of Thomas, it's clearly a Gnostic worldview. It's clearly believed that we're all divine sparks, and we're here to experience the world for what it is, to sort of suffer into pain in order to seek enlightenment. But we have to remember our true aspects if we are to truly seek knowledge and enlightenment. Otherwise, we become slaves to the system. Otherwise, we're too focused on material acquisitions. Otherwise, we're too focused on making money. And this was a direct threat to the system because this would overturn the status quo, right? The Roman society is a very strict hierarchy. And to say that the person with all the money has no authority over me, the person with all the power has no authority over me because I'm a divine soul, that could be very upsetting. So we also know that Jesus spent a lot of time with slaves and the oppressed. Well, this is a problem because a slave is considered economic property. So if you tell a slave, hey man, you're a divine soul, you shouldn't be a slave, and the slave either decides to quit or runs away, that's economic damage. And at that time in history, if you were to insult someone, you might get hit at. But if you actually steal from someone, they killed you, right? Because remember the crucifixion. There were 3 people who were crucified: Jesus and 2 thieves, right? So I think that Jesus, with his message, was liberating slaves psychologically and emotionally and giving tremendous comfort to them. But this made them less productive, in which case, you're causing economic damage. You're destroying property. So he was considered basically a rebel.
You said Paul was a spy that used Jesus as a political symbol. Do you think the CIA uses mind control to create terrorists?
Look, I think if you just look at the history of the Middle East, a lot of these Islamic extremists were a creation of empire, right? So let's go back to 1950s and the spreading of Wahhabism throughout Saudi Arabia and throughout the Islamic world, which then became, of course, Al-Qaeda. Well, if you go back to the 1950s, this was heavily encouraged by the Americans and the British for 3 reasons, okay? The first is that America was at war with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, right? And you couldn't fight the Soviet Union on a battlefield because that would lead to a nuclear war. So what you had to do is sabotage them from within. And there was a sizable Muslim minority in the Soviet Union, I think about like maybe 20 to 30%. That's a lot of people, all congregated in the south of the Soviet Union, which has always been problematic for the Soviet Union, right? There were that many Muslims in America. So why wouldn't you encourage fanatical, violent extremism right? That's number one. So that works to the benefit of the Americans and the British. Second is that at this time in the Middle East, the Middle East had tremendous oil, right? And there were certain movements in the Middle East that would counter the power of the Anglo-American Empire. These included nationalism, these included pan-Arabism, and included socialism. So you go to Iran in 1950s, where they democratically elected a leader who wanted to nationalize the oil industry rather than just give it for free to the British, right? And so nationalism and socialism were problems for the Americans and the British. So what do? Well, you promote Islamic extremism as a counter to nationalism and socialism, right? And the third thing is that Islamic extremism destabilizes the Middle East. We've seen this play out over and over again. And so how does this instability help America and Britain? Because it stabilizes Israel, right? So if you go look at ISIS, it's really funny how ISIS never attacked Israel. You would think that these Islamic extremists would hate Jews the most. But for whatever reason, they've never attacked Israel. In fact, we have quite a few instances where the American military arrested an Islamic extremist and they discovered, oh, we have to let him go because he's a Mossad agent. So there are lots, if you actually just go to the Middle East and you ask around, they'll tell you this. They'll tell you, well, ISIS was probably a CIA creation. The Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, were all financed by the CIA. Because remember, they went from Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan to become mujahideen, to fight the Soviets. And so the CIA financed all this.
Who do you think is Satoshi Nakamoto?
Well, I mean, they say that it translates into Central Intelligence. And the story makes no sense, right? Because why would you spend years, possibly decades, in your basement creating a new technology, the blockchain technology, and then just give it for free to the world? And right, that makes no sense.
It does sound a little ridiculous.
It sounds kind of ridiculous, right? So then you have to ask yourself three questions. First of all, is who would have the technology and the expertise to create something like the blockchain? Second of all, you have to ask who would benefit from this blockchain creation? And the third question you want to ask is, why would they keep it secret? Okay, and when you do game theory analysis, you look at all possibilities, you end up with a deep state, the American deep state. You end up with the CIA, okay? So the first question, who would have the expertise and the technology to create the blockchain? Probably the same people who created the internet. Probably the same people who created GPS, DARPA, NSA, CIA. Probably these guys, right? If they create the internet, blockchain, it's just more of an enclosed model of the internet, right? Where the internet is open, but the blockchain is actually closed up to certain members, but everything is transparent within the blockchain, right? So that's the first question. Second question is, who would benefit from blockchain? Well, the CIA, because of two things. One is surveillance, where they're able to monitor everything, right? It's almost like a Trojan horse if you were to use blockchain. Second is like the CIA, it does a lot of black ops. It is a government within a government, right? It is basically outside of all political control. But it needs a mechanism to finance its operations. It basically needs a money laundering operation. And blockchain is a great mechanism to finance a lot of its operations, especially drug trafficking, okay? Third question is, why would they keep it secret? And the answer is, only if people believe that this was transparent, open, and beyond authority, beyond political control, does it have value, right? So the moment people recognize that this is a CIA operation, people won't put their money into blockchain. People won't put their money into Bitcoin. They'll be like, I mean, why would I do that? You have to ask yourself this question. Where are the blockchain servers located? Right? Because I imagine if you're able to control the hardware, you can also control the software. I don't care what they tell me about open source and all that. I want to know where the databases are, where the servers are, physically.
It's interesting too that it's designed like a religion.
Yeah. I'll tell something else, okay? Mark Zuckerberg.
That's what I was going to ask you about. Yeah.
So Mark Zuckerberg had this conflict with the Winklevoss,
Winklevoss twins. Yeah.
the Winklevoss twins, okay? And so the Winklevoss twins sued Mark Zuckerberg, claiming that Zuckerberg stole the idea for Facebook from them. Okay, and this went to court, and there was a settlement. I forget the amount, okay? But then the Winklevoss twins took a sizable portion of the settlement and put it all in Bitcoin. Like, we're talking about millions of dollars into Bitcoin when it was like just a novelty. Why would people do that?
They're the largest individual owners today, I believe.
I don't know that, but I'm just saying, like, back then, when this was a novelty, when this was a niche thing, and these are not technologists, right? Why would they put millions and millions of dollars into this thing? That's really strange.
You've said figures like Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates are not geniuses, but front people. Sam Altman didn't invent ChatGPT or LLMs. Steve Jobs didn't invent the iPhone. Do you think the government invented social media and AI?
So if you go back to the 1970s, the government had a huge credibility problem. And the Pentagon had put all this money into the internet as a surveillance tool, right? They wanted to promote the internet and computers as a way to control people. But the problem is, Americans had just experienced the Vietnam War. And there were the church committee hearings. And so Americans knew the CIA was this evil organization. So there was absolutely no trust in government. There was also the Watergate hearings. Before that, the assassinations of like Martin Luther King, JFK, RFK. Okay, so the government had absolutely no trust in government. So you needed a strategy of how to make people believe computers were safe and cute and innocuous. And the strategy they came up with is, let's just open source this to nerds, right? So if you're able to sell computers to the public, you go make the billions of dollars, right? So Steve Jobs partnered with Steve Wozniak, okay? And at that time, people don't know this, but Steve Wozniak was an employee of Hewlett-Packard, which is a defense contractor, okay? And so whatever he created actually belonged as an IP to HP, right? So Steve Wozniak creates this open source computer, and then he goes to his superiors at HP and says, look, I'm working for you guys. You guys are giving me the paycheck. Listen, this computer, I'm happy to give it to you guys And they told him, no, we don't want it. No, go sell yourself. It's yours. And that's kind of strange. And then he becomes a billionaire along with Bill Gates.
So HP gave Steve Wozniak the ability to sell Mac for free.
Okay, so Steve Wozniak was an employee of HP, and he was trained by HP, meaning his engineering skills came from that environment, and he had access to all of HP's technology, and that's how he was able to construct a personal computer from scratch, right? Because of the expertise provided to him from his employer. So technically, it should belong to HP.
Right.
But they came to an agreement where HP would not claim any IP over this computer, okay? So think of a university. If you're Stanford, right? Stanford owns some parts of Google because, Larry Page and Sergey Brin developed Google at Stanford, right? Because you have access to all of Stanford's technology and expertise. But when Steve Wozniak designed the Apple computer, HP said, no, we don't want anything. We don't want to be involved in this. Right? And you have to ask yourself, why would they do that?
I think there's about 3,000 like individual billionaires publicly documented by Forbes. Like, did we, like 100 years ago, was that a thing where there were all these individual billionaires that had these come from nothing stories where they invented this great product and sold it? Or was that only a necessity after Vietnam?
I think this is a recent phenomenon. If you go back to the Gilded Age, these billionaires like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, what people don't recognize is that, like, when they died, if you actually look at their net worth, how much they bestowed onto their children and grandchildren, it was only a fraction of their total net worth. So where did all that other money go, right? And they were actually spending a lot of their money on charity. So Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller were known for that. And what people don't recognize is that they had a problem, which is everyone assumed in America that these were self-made billionaires. This is the American dream, right? They were the paragons of the American dream. You come to America, you have nothing, but then suddenly, overnight, by working hard, you're a billionaire or a trillionaire, okay? And what they don't recognize is that these are just agents, representatives of the city of London. So they need to disguise the fact that they didn't actually have that much money, right? And the way they disguise that is by donating the money to charity and saying, oh, well, I gave it all away before I died.
Right. I'll ask you, do you think science is the most worshipped religion on earth? This is a thought I had watching your videos, is what happens when an entire group of people worships one religion is it never feels like a religion, it feels like the truth.
Look, let's look at COVID, okay? So COVID, you have this virus going around. It was mutating very, very fast. And then they, in I think less than a year, right? 8-9 months, they introduced the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine. And this thing was never tested. It usually takes about 10 years to develop a vaccine that's effective. And that's when a virus stabilizes. But we know during that time, the virus was constantly mutating. So they designed a vaccine to try to stop a constantly mutating virus, which we know doesn't work. And there's a lot of dissenters. Like the most famous, I think, at that time was Brett Weinstein. And he was telling, I was watching a lot of his podcasts, okay? But he was explaining to the public, the audience, a basic fact about viruses. Okay, the virus is constantly shifting, mutating, right? When you have a vaccine, the vaccine is a fortification against the virus. But if the virus is shifting, what the virus will do is develop strategies to evade the fortification, right? Because it can shift. Your fortifications cannot. So what you're doing if you're introducing a vaccine into this situation is you're training the virus to be much more evasive. So you shouldn't do that, okay? Very simple logic, right? We're just using logic here. I'm just saying, unless the virus has stabilized, you don't know what it will do. So don't build fortifications yet, because these fortifications will be half-assed, it will not be effective. And all that will happen is the virus become much more evasive because of that, right? Just a simple fact. How many people took the vaccine?
80% of the US?
Well, and was there any, and how many of these people question the logic and the evidence behind the vaccines?
20%. Yeah.
And after it was revealed that there might be some side effects to this vaccines, including myocarditis, okay, not strong evidence, but I'm saying there might be some side effects because whenever you introduce a new vaccine at scale to hundreds of millions of people, there's always going to be side effects, right? So, and myocarditis might be one of the side effects, but how many people question that?
Not many.
And when, CNN makes fun of Joe Rogan for promoting ivermectin, even though ivermectin won a Nobel Prize, how many people thought CNN was correct? I mean, it's just astonishing how the vast majority of people during the COVID era shut off their brains and just accepted whatever science told them. And just stop asking the most fundamental, basic questions anyone should ask about anything.
Do you think it's fair to say that the most popular religion is one that never feels like a religion?
I would say so, yeah. Science prides itself on being above religion, on being entirely focused on the truth. But truth can only be arrived at through debate, through questioning, through exploration. How much debate happened during the COVID epidemic? None. If you try to debate this, they shut you down. They ostracize you from society. That seems to me like a religion.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Because if you look at the origins of it, it's like, it comes from magic, right?
Yeah. Look, I mean, clearly that thing was a bioweapon of some sort. Because in nature, viruses do not mutate that fast. It makes no sense for a virus to mutate that fast because a virus is trying to survive by inserting itself into a host. So if the host dies, it dies as well, right? So the strategy for a virus is to be innocuous enough to infiltrate the host. So why would you constantly become much more powerful over time? Why would you become faster over time? It makes no sense. So clearly this came from gain of function research that I think was supported and financed by the US military. And because Obama had issued a ban on gain of function research, this research was then subcontracted to China. Which also tells you the world probably doesn't work the way you think it does, right? Because if China and the United States are competitors, why would the US military subcontract biological weapons research, by the way, to a research facility in China that is affiliated with the Chinese military?
But Professor Zhang, you're Chinese, I'm American. We're supposed to be enemies, right?
Yeah, and then the world will be perfect. Yes.
What do you think are the three biggest lies humans have been told?
I think the three biggest lies are death is the final reckoning, whereas I think death is actually the beginning. I think that if you look at secret societies, the way they initiate you into the society is through death. They pretend that you died. They bury you. And the reason why is that every time you die, you can look at yourself for who you are and choose a better path. So you're able to let go of who you are. And that's why I think death is important, because death allows for rebirth and rejuvenation. It allows for a reset. And I think that's a mechanism of knowledge accumulation where if you are making a mistake in this life, don't worry about it because you're going to die, and you'll probably come back at a later point and learn from your mistakes. But don't be afraid to die. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. It's all part of the growing process. So I think death is one of the greatest lies, and it's a very destructive lie where, for whatever reason, everyone's afraid to die, so they spend billions of dollars trying to live forever, right? So I think that's a huge lie. The second big lie is that we are individually powerless. We don't matter, right? So there's this war going on in Iran. Well, we can't affect its outcome because we're not warriors. We don't have an army. So let's just sit back and watch OnlyFans or play video games or gamble how the war will turn out. But as I say, as I said before, we're all a reflection of the universe. And what we do matters. If we choose to live a good life ourselves, the universe will be better for it. So don't worry about what's happening in the Middle East. Don't worry about geopolitics. Just worry about being a good person, being kind, open, and generous to everyone around you. And you have made the world a better place. You do matter. And the great lie is that you don't matter. The great lie is that you have absolutely no impact in this world. And unfortunately, too many people have believed this lie and have absolved themselves of both agency as well as responsibility.
I like those a lot. Do you think another lie is history is random?
So they don't say history is random. They say history is teleological, meaning that history is moving towards a greater purpose and that we improve generation by generation, right? So do you look at our advances since the scientific revolution? And I think that we've deluded ourselves into believing that we're at the height of civilization, that because we have airplanes, that because we have skyscrapers, because we have the internet, we've achieved the greatest civilization ever in human history. But then you go and you look at a place like Egypt, which built the pyramids. And like, we can't explain the pyramids.
We can't even build them today, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, so if we're the greatest civilization ever in human history, why can't we build the pyramids? There's so much of history hidden from us. And so we've just deluded ourselves into believing that we're so much better than everyone else. We're so much superior than every other civilization that's come before us, when I don't think that's actually true. When I think that, if you go and you explore these indigenous communities around the world, maybe the natives, the Inuits in Canada, or, Aboriginal groups in New Zealand, if you actually spend time with them, you find that they are really happy, balanced people with a deep sense of their own self-worth and meaning and purpose in their lives. And I think that's a goal worth striving for, right? Whereas we're just these empty vessels trying to increase the number in our bank account for no particular reason. We don't have a story of who we are, what we're doing here, and where we're going. They do. And I think that's what gives them joy and purpose in life.